Welcome to Women Who Kick Class, the podcast that dives into the fearless women who changed history and the fights that are still shaping our world today. From suffragists to civil rights activists, these women refuse to back down, breaking barriers and demanding change. And now, here's your host, an advocate, a storyteller, and a woman who kicks class herself, Ann Potenza.
Jeannette Rankin was an American politician and a women's rights advocate who was the very first woman to serve in the United States Congress. Jeannette was born on June 11, 1880 in Missoula, Montana. She was one of 7 children and was the daughter of a rancher and a school teacher. Growing up on a ranch, Jeannette had a lot of chores she had to do. She had cleaning, sewing, farm chores, and she also had to help take care of her siblings. She even helped maintain the ranch machinery, and one time she even built a wooden sidewalk on a building that her father owned just so it could be rented. As a child, she even observed that in the 1890s, women on the western frontier may have worked side by side with men, but they did not have equal say when it came to having a political voice because they didn't have the right to vote. Jeannette did graduate from high school in 1898, and she went on to graduate from the University of Montana with a Bachelor of Science degree. And as a young woman, she explored many careers before getting into politics. She was considering dressmaking, furniture making, and being a teacher. But after her father died in 1904, Jeannette had to take on the responsibility of taking care of her younger siblings. When Jeannette was 27, she moved to San Francisco to accept a job as a social worker, which was a new field at that time. And she felt that this was her calling. So she wound up going back to New York and studying for a year at the New York School of Philanthropy. She then worked briefly as a social worker in Spokane, Washington, and then took classes at the University of Washington. And it was there that she became involved in the women's suffrage movement. In 1910, Washington was the 5th state in the Union to permanently enfranchise women in the state constitution. When she returned to New York, Jeannette became an organizer of the New York Women's Suffrage Party, which aimed to do the same thing in its state constitution as Washington did. And during this time, Jeannette would also travel to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress on behalf of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Eventually, Jeannette returned to Montana and began to rise among the ranks of the suffrage organizations. She was the president of the Montana Women's Suffrage Association, and she also became the secretary of NASA. And it was in 1911 when she was the first woman to speak in front of the Montana legislature, arguing in support of enfranchisement for women's rights in her home state. It took 3 years, but in 1914, Montana did become the 7th state to permanently allow women voting rights in their state constitution. Now, in the election of 1916, Jeannette decided to run for one of the 2 at-large House seats that was open in the Montana congressional election. And she had support from her brother, who was very active in the Montana Republican Party. But because Montana's population was widely scattered, Jeannette had to travel far and wide to reach the constituents that she hoped to get the vote from. She would rally support at the train stations, on street corners. She would go to potluck dinners. She would go to remote one-room schoolhouses just to try to reach the people. And she ran as a progressive, emphasizing her support of suffrage, social welfare, and prohibition. In the Republican primary, Jeannette received the most votes out of the 8 candidates who were running. And in the general election, they would choose the top 2 of the most vote getters, and Jeannette finished second, which made her the first woman to be elected to Congress. And during her victory speech as the only woman in Congress with voting power in the country, she said, "I am deeply conscious of the responsibility resting upon me." Her election gained so much national attention, and she also got many marriage proposals because of it. Shortly after her term began, Congress was called into a special session in response to Germany declaring unrestricted submarine warfare on all Atlantic shipping. And it was on April 2nd, 1917, when President Woodrow Wilson, in a joint session, asked Congress to declare war on Germany. And there was intense debate for 4 days about this decision. And it was at 3 a.m. when the vote was taken. And Jeannette was one of 50 votes in opposition of declaring war. And she said, "I wish to stand for my country, but I cannot vote for war." It was years later that she said, "I felt the first time the first woman had a chance to say no to war, she should say it." And even though there were 49 other male representatives and 6 male senators who voted against the declaration of war, it was Jeannette that received the most criticism. While Jeannette was in office, she also pushed for better working conditions for laborers. That year, there was a huge mine disaster in Butte, and over 168 workers were dead. The workers called a massive protest strike against the conditions, and Jeannette tried to intervene, and she tried to meet with the mining companies and the workers, but they refused, and her proposed legislation to end the strike was unsuccessful. But she did have better success with working conditions for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. She listened to the grievances from the workers who were upset about the long working hours and the demand to keep increasing the pace, and she sent an investigative reporter to investigate. And because of her efforts to draw attention to these working conditions, the Treasury Secretary eventually conducted his own investigation, which ultimately led to the workday of 8 hours. By 1917, women had been granted some form of voting rights in about 40 of the states. But Jeannette continued the movement for unrestricted universal enfranchisement. She became one of the founding members of the Committee on Women's Suffrage, and the next year the committee delivered its report to Congress, with Jeannette opening up the congressional debate on a constitutional amendment granting universal suffrage to women. The resolution passed in the House, but was defeated in the Senate. The following year, the same resolution passed both chambers, but Jeannette's congressional term had already ended. After ratification of 3/4 of the states, it became the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So even though Jeannette wasn't in Congress when the 19th Amendment was officially ratified, she is the only woman to have ever voted on a resolution for the 19th Amendment. After leaving Congress, Jeannette worked as a field secretary for the National Consumers League and as a lobbyist for various pacifist organizations. She fought for a constitutional amendment that would ban child labor, and she also supported the Shepard-Towner Act, which was the first federal social welfare program for women and children. The legislation did pass in 1921, but was then repealed 8 years later. But many of the key points were incorporated into the Social Security Act of 1935. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, Jeannette was not done with her activism. She went on to help found the American Civil Liberties Union, and she would travel around the country making speeches on behalf of the Women's Peace Union and the National Council for the Prevention of War. Now, fast forward to 1937, Jeannette opposed President Franklin Roosevelt's proposal to intervene on the British side against Germany and its allies, arguing that both sides wished to avoid a second European war and would pursue a diplomatic resolution. She testified before Congress on multiple times against this, and when it became clear that her lobbying efforts were ineffective, Jeannette decided to run for Congress again. She began her campaign for Congress in 1939 with a tour of high schools in Montana. This meant she would speak at 52 of the 56 high schools in her district. And in the 1940 race, at the age of 60 years old, Jeannette defeated the incumbent congressman, and she won her second term in Congress. And it was at this time when members of Congress and their constituents had been debating the question of U.S. intervention in World War II for months. And then the attack on Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, which galvanized the country in the direction of war and silenced all opposition. The day after, on December 8th, Jeannette was the only member of Congress to vote against the declaration of war against Japan. When she cast her vote, hisses could be heard in the gallery, and her colleagues asked her to change her vote or to at least abstain, but she wouldn't. She refused. She said, "As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else." After the vote was finalized, the reporters pursued Jeannette into the cloakroom, and she had to take refuge in a phone booth where she eventually had to have Capitol Police escort her out of the building. Not only was she inundated with angry telegrams and phone calls, but even her brother sent her a cable that said, "Montana is 100% against you." The next day, the photo of her trapped in the phone booth were in newspapers all over the country. While her vote was ridiculed in the press, there was a progressive journalist who actually acknowledged her courage in making that decision. This is what he said. "Probably 100 men in Congress would have liked to do what she did. Not one of them had the courage to do it. The Gazette entirely disagrees with the wisdom of her position, but Lord, it was a brave thing, and its bravery some way discounted its folly. When in 100 years from now, courage, sheer courage based upon moral indignation is celebrated in this country, the name of Jeannette Rankin, who stood firm in folly for her faith, will be written in monumental bronze, not for what she did, but for the way she did it." 3 days later, a similar war declaration against Germany and Italy came to a vote, but this time, Jeannette abstained. And with her political career effectively over, Jeannette did not run again for re-election in 1942. Jeannette was asked years later if she regretted her decision, and she said, "Never. If you're against the war, you're against war regardless of what happens. It's a wrong method of trying to settle a dispute." Even John F. Kennedy wrote about Jeannette's decision. He said, "Few members of Congress have ever stood more alone while being true to a higher honor and loyalty." Reflecting on Jeannette's decision to stand alone and to vote in Congress what she thought was right, knowing that she would lose her seat in the next election, knowing her political career was over, but knowing that that was the right thing to do for the country. How many congresspersons today can stand and look at themselves in the mirror and know that they have done the same thing? It takes a lot of courage to stand alone. Even though technically Jeannette's political career may have been over with the United States Congress, it didn't mean her activism and her pursuit of what she thought was right would be over. She continued for the next 20 years. She traveled the world. She visited India. She studied the pacifist teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. And in the 60s and 70s, when a new generation of pacifists and feminists and civil rights advocates found inspiration in Jeannette's work and embraced her efforts in ways that her own generation had not, she mobilized again in response to the Vietnam War. In 1968, the Jeannette Rankin Brigade, which was a coalition of women's peace groups, organized an anti-war march in Washington, D.C., which was the largest march by women since the Women's Suffrage Parade of 1913. Jeannette led 5,000 participants from the Union Building to the steps of the Capitol, where they presented a peace petition to the House Speaker. And a few years later, Jeannette, even though she was well into her 90s, she considered a third run for Congress just to gain a wider audience for her opposition to the Vietnam War. But her age and her ill health forced her to abandon that mission. When Jeannette spoke at the Montana Constitutional Convention in 1972, her words sum up what she wished she would be remembered for. If I am remembered for no other act, she said, I want to be remembered as the only woman who ever voted to give women the right to vote. In her life, she also went on to say, I may be the first woman member of Congress, but I won't be the last. And since Jeannette Rankin first took office in 1917, a total of 449 women have served in Congress as of 2025. So she was right. I hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit about Jeannette Rankin. Her passion, her courage, and her legacy is an inspiration for all of us. And I hope that you'll join me next week when we conclude this season of Women Who Kick Glass. I'm Ann Potenza, and until then, keep kicking glass.
Thanks for listening to Women Who Kick Glass. Be sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more, contact the show. Visit womenwhokickglass.com. Until next time, keep kicking glass.